My lady, I think that we can proceed to the next witness straight away. If somebody would be good enough to sever the link with Sir Jeremy, we'll return to the witness box.
Just before Mr. Sturgeon gives evidence, I'd like to apologise to those who were inconvenienced by the fact we didn't call Miss Calderwood on Wednesday morning. It was due entirely to unforeseen circumstances, and I can assure people we gave everyone as much notice as we could and as we got, in fact. So,
My lady, yes.
Apologies to anybody. Mr. Keith?
Could the witness be sworn, please?
Repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you, welcome.
Could you give the inquiry, please, your full name?
Nicola Sturgeon.
Ms. Sturgeon, thank you for offering your assistance and providing it to this inquiry. Whilst you give evidence, could you please remember to keep your voice up so that we may all clearly hear what you have to say, and also for our hard-working stenographer so that she can record your evidence.
Excuse me, my lady, with your permission, would it be possible to say a few words by way of introduction?
You may.
Thank you. I'm appearing at this public inquiry for the first time, and as the First Minister of Scotland for the duration of the pandemic, I wanted to take a brief opportunity to offer my sympathies and condolences to all those who have suffered as a result of COVID-19. The pandemic may be over, but for very many people that suffering continues to this day, and there is not a day that passes that I don't think about that. Secondly, I want to convey my thanks to all those who contributed to the national response, obviously to our health and care workforce, but to all of those across the public, voluntary and private sectors. And of course to the general public, who did everything that was asked of them and made extraordinary sacrifices. Finally, my lady, I know that every day the government I led did our best to take the best possible decisions. But equally, I know that we did not get everything right. The learning from the pandemic is of critical importance, and this public inquiry has a central role to play in ensuring that those lessons are learned, and therefore I appreciate the opportunity to be here before you for the first occasion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sturgeon. You say the first occasion because, of course, it's known to my lady, but not necessarily the wider world, that you will be giving evidence again before this inquiry for the purposes of Module 2A, which will be the module that will be more particularly concerned with the response to the pandemic once, of course, it had struck. Ms. Sturgeon, you've provided kindly a witness statement dated, I think, the 19th of April 2023. We needn't bring it up, but it's a witness statement to which you have appended your signature and a statement of truth. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You were, of course, as you said, the First Minister of Scotland, but earlier in your career, you were Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Health, and coincidentally, that was during the swine flu pandemic, which hit the United Kingdom in 2009. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so you would have become familiar with the exquisite difficulties of dealing with the onset of a pandemic on a country and familiar with governmental response.
Yes.
Just to get our bearings, that pandemic, H1N1, as we've heard, was, by the general standards of these things, relatively mild, was it not?
Yes, indeed. Milder, thankfully, than any of us had expected at the outset of it.
There were some 1,500 hospitalisations in Scotland. Fortuitously, no deaths, I believe, but of course there were around about 17,000 deaths globally. There may therefore be a limit as to what lessons could have been learnt from that milder pandemic. But the Scottish Government commissioned a paper, did it not, to review its own response to that pandemic.
We did, yes.
And was that a report or a paper that you yourself commissioned?
Yes, I believe I would have commissioned that as Health Secretary at the time.
May we have, please, that paper on the screen, 102936. It's headed Cabinet Subcommittee on Scottish Government Resilience, Influenza H1N1 Pandemic Review of the Scottish Government Response, and it was a paper by the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing. You were Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Health, and therefore may we presume that was you?
I'd have to check the date of it to see whether I was still Health Secretary when that paper was produced, but I believe that would have been me, yes. Mm-hmm.
I think the paper was produced in 2011. You were Cabinet Secretary for Health until the 19th of May 2011.
I was Cabinet Secretary for Health into late 2012.
Yes.
That would have been me in that case.
Yes. You were Cabinet Secretary for Health until the 19th of May 2011, and then you became Cabinet Secretary for Health, Wellbeing and City Strategy thereafter.
Thank you for reminding me.
Page 5 of the report refers at the bottom of the page to planning assumptions. Respondents recognised the limitations of modelling. However, it was felt that it would have been helpful to have updated the planning assumptions more quickly to reflect the picture on the ground, in effect reflecting the most likely scenario rather than the worst case scenario. Respondents felt it would have been helpful for the process of testing the planning assumptions to be more explicit. The planning assumptions which were published did not hold much weight with respondents on the grounds that they did not reflect what they were experiencing. Ms. Sturgeon, these references to the planning assumptions and to national and local responders' views as to how efficient or how useful that they were, was that a reference to the broad governmental system by which risks are assessed, grouped together, and assumptions made for the purposes of planning as to how those risks should be addressed?
So my reading of these paragraphs, and forgive me, I would need to see these paragraphs in the context of the whole paper to be certain that what I'm about to say is correct. But certainly in relation to the second bullet point there, what that seems to me to reflect is something that was certainly true in the handling of the H1N1 pandemic, is that the pandemic did not unfold in the way that the plans and the modelling and the reasonable worst case scenario estimates had indicated that it would. And that had relevance, I think, to what we learned about the strengths and weaknesses of pre-pandemic planning. So my reading of that is that that was a statement about the gap that opened up during the swine flu pandemic between what the plan told us would happen and what in reality happened.
That issue, the divergence between risk assessment, plan, identification of response, and the reality of a pandemic, was an issue that continued to bedevil this area of strategy planning, did it not?
Yes, it did. I think that is fair comment. I also, having now in different capacities, as we've been covering, been involved in the response to two pandemics, I, to some extent, think that there is an inevitability about that being a problem that will always exist to some extent, because there is no plan that will ever completely replicate what happens in reality when a pandemic, unfortunately, confronts us.
Indeed. And page 11, relatedly, in the middle of the page, there is this heading, actions to be taken forward as part of the UK-wide review into the influenza A H1N1 response. Was that a reference to the review which was carried out, in fact, by Dame Deirdre Hine?
That would have been a reference to the Hine Review, yes.
We'll oversee the work of the review team through Scottish Government representation on the reference group. We'll consider the implications for Scotland of the emerging findings, specifically those relating to, and then the bottom bullet point, future iterations of the pandemic flu framework. Was that reference to pandemic flu framework a reference to the then pre-existing Scottish strategy for dealing with pandemic flu, and also the prospective, the anticipated United Kingdom strategy for dealing with influenza pandemic, which we'll come to in a moment?
Mm-hmm. So I suspect that would have been effectively both of those things. It would have been a reference to whatever pandemic flu framework was in existence at the time, the pre-existing Scottish Government one, and then what became the UK-wide pandemic flu preparedness plan in 2011.
Thereafter, Ms Sturgeon, as my lady has heard in the course of evidence, under the Four Nations approach, the United Kingdom drew up and disseminated a new 2011 strategy, and that is, or became, the sole strategy for dealing with pandemics. And it was, of course, a strategy which on its face dealt only with influenza pandemic. There was a commitment there in that review by the Scottish Government to keeping future iterations of the pandemic strategy under review. But to a very large extent, that did not happen, did it?
The 2011 Four Nations plan was not updated. Now, for that to have been updated on a Four Nations basis would obviously have required the engagement of all four governments. In my view, and this takes us to the heart of some of the most important lessons I learned from the swine flu pandemic, had that plan been updated, I do not necessarily think it would have changed substantially. I think I heard Professor Sir Chris Whitty make a similar point to you last week. That a review, refresh, different iteration of that would not have changed necessarily the fundamental assumptions or planning or modelling at the heart of it. In brief, the two lessons that I took from swine flu in relation to plans were firstly, and I've already touched on this, the importance of any plan being adaptable and flexible when it first confronts reality. In summary, what happened in swine flu was that as the pandemic thankfully turned out to be milder than we had anticipated, there was a period when the governments tried to make the pandemic fit the plan rather than adapt the plan to the pandemic. So flexibility is the first point. The second point, I guess, relates to that, is the importance of whatever is on the paper in the form of a plan, there is work done to operationalise and test that plan. I'm sure we'll come on to some questions around exercise Cygnus on a UK basis, Silver Swan on a Scottish basis to a lesser extent, because it was looking at MERS, SARS rather than flu, exercise IRIS. But the work that was done through these exercises and the work in Scotland that was done by local resilience partnerships sitting underneath our regional resilience partnerships, in my view, was more important than having tweaked versions of a plan that was only ever going to be a template for the situation that we ultimately found ourselves dealing with.
As it turned out, Ms. Sturgeon, the reality was that the plan, the strategy, the 2011 document required not just tweaking, and it may well be that it wouldn't just have stopped at tweaking had it been significantly revised. It was, and has been described by a variety of witnesses, as wholly inadequate, strategically. And do you accept that there is now a much clearer understanding as to the nature and the degree of the inadequacy of that document?
So yes, and if I may, I'll perhaps try to break that down briefly into two parts.
Please.
And perhaps give a little bit more explanation for my use of the term tweak. Had a process to update that plan focused on updating an influenza preparedness plan, I can't be sure about this, but I do not believe it would have changed significantly, because it would still have been a plan dealing with the potential for a flu pandemic. Had it been a process designed to turn a flu plan into a plan that was looking at a different range of pandemics, that may have been a more substantive exercise. In terms of your question, do I accept that the plan was inadequate? In summary, yes, the plan was for a different type of pandemic than the one we unfortunately were confronted with. What I would say in addition, though, is that does not mean no part of that plan was useful in any way, because some of the consequence planning for a pandemic, I mean, there are some, as we know, and we'll come on to no doubt today and in future modules, significant differences with significant consequences between flu and what we ended up dealing with in terms of a coronavirus pandemic. But some of the consequences were similar. So I would, I guess, push back a little bit against the notion that there was nothing in the flu planning that served us any purpose at all when it came to COVID-19.
You would accept, I think, that there was no plan for non-influenza pandemic, at least on its own face, correct?
That is absolutely the case. That is not to say that there was no thinking within governments around non-influenza diseases, high consequence infectious diseases. Exercise Iris, which was a Scottish Government exercise, looked at that specifically. What there wasn't, and I think this is the significant gap, is there was no set plan, which, as I say, is not the same as saying there was no thinking, into how we dealt with a pandemic that had features and characteristics of flu in terms of transmissibility, but also the severity and what we came to understand in terms of the asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19. So if we look at Exercise Iris, it was looking at a MERS-SARS type incident, but not a pandemic, one that was small and very contained. Yes. So I would readily accept that there was a gap in terms of the pandemic we ultimately were dealing with. But as I say, that does not mean the plan that was in place had no utility at all.
No, and I'm not suggesting it had no utility. The plan on its face called for flexible application. It called for flexibility. It proclaimed the fact that viral respiratory pathogenic outbreaks are by their nature inherently unpredictable, and therefore that the plan should be applied to non-influenza pandemics. But there was no development of that thinking, was there, in the plan? There was no debate about what those inherently unpredictable characteristics might consist of, the differences in the transmission rate, or viral load, or severity, or incubation period. That's correct, isn't it?
That is correct. That said, and I obviously I'm not a scientific clinical expert in any way, shape or form, but it may have been difficult to capture the range of possibilities that you've just alluded to there in a single plan. I think the other point I would make about the utility or otherwise of plans, had the flu plan been reviewed and turned into something that was looking at pandemics or the potential pandemics more widely, whether that plan would have served its purpose would have depended on the capabilities that lay underneath that plan. So I'm straying slightly perhaps into future modules here, but for me the questions in my mind, literally every day, are not so much did we lack a plan, but did we lack the capabilities for dealing with a pandemic of the nature of COVID-19? And obviously I'm talking there about contact tracing, testing,
Indeed.
Infrastructure in particular.
But you would accept, Ms Sturgeon, that had the plan focused more plainly, more clearly on the inherent unpredictability of viral respiratory pathogens and their characteristics, and identified that the next pandemic might have different characteristics to influenza in terms of transmission rate, incubation period, viral load, severity, it is likely there would have been a much closer and clearer debate about the necessary countermeasures. For example, mass diagnostic testing, mass contact tracing, social restrictions, quarantining, and so on. And that debate was wholly absent, wasn't it, from that strategy and from all the contemporaneous material?
Much of that, yes, was absent from that. So I do think that is fair. And yes, with retrospect and in hindsight, I think we would all have benefited from much earlier discussion around some of these things. I suppose the only point I'm making, maybe this comes from too many years in government, not now, obviously, is I think there is a real danger in putting an overemphasis on plans. There is often a tendency in government to say, well, we have a plan, it sits on the shelf, and so we've done the preparation. And it's what, as I think you're putting to me fairly, it's what lies underneath that. And had there been a plan that looked at the range of pandemics other than flu, then yes, it is possible that we would have had greater discussion around some of the elements that, of course, came very much to the fore when COVID struck.
The reason I put the question to you, Ms Sturgeon, the way that I did, was to respond to your suggestion that the acknowledged strategic flaws in the plan may not have mattered because what matters more is capability.
Absolutely.
My point to you is, had there been a proper development of the issues of the required countermeasures necessary to meet properly identified risks of non-influenza pandemics in that document, that capability is likely to have been better developed by the time COVID struck.
I think that is fair, and I would accept that. I think it would come down to how precise some of those other predictions or models had been. But I think that is a fair comment to put to me.
And your point about the danger in government of selecting a plan in the reasonable expectation that it will do what it says on the tin and it will meet the need of the exigency or emergency which has arisen. Would you agree that that plan tended to focus upon managing the catastrophic consequences of a pandemic influenza as opposed to trying to prevent those catastrophic consequences from developing in the first place?
I'm not sure I do entirely agree with that. And again, I'm perhaps straying from your question being anchored in the flu preparedness plan and projecting a little bit to some of the commentary that's been made around the handling of COVID. I suppose there is a question in my mind in the context of a pandemic. What do we mean by prevention? I think there is a question about whether any single country at a population level could prevent, i.e. stop a pandemic happening. Clearly there are measures at an individual level that people try to take to prevent themselves getting it. But in the context of a pandemic, it is, and I can only speak for myself and the Scottish Government here, it was never the case when COVID struck that we just accepted as a given that a reasonable worst-case scenario was going to unfold. It was our determination from the outset to do everything we could, and I think this is what prevention means in the pandemic context, to suppress it to the maximum. The questions, I think, that are really important for us all to consider very, very frankly is, could or should we have done more to suppress to the maximum COVID. But speaking on behalf of the government I led at the time, it was never the case that we simply accepted there is a level of harm that is going to be done by this virus, and we accept that. We were always, in fact, it became later on one of the points of difference between the Scottish and the UK government, the extent to which we were still seeking to suppress as opposed to live with the virus. So I don't accept that there was ever, certainly in my mind, an acceptance of a level of harm that we were willing to have unfold.
That was not, however, my question, Ms Sturgeon. My question revolved around the strategy and whether you accepted that one of the unintended consequences of that strategy was that it tended to focus administrative concentration on trying to deal with the consequences of a catastrophic emergency rather than preventing it in the first place. For example, you've already acknowledged that the absence of thinking on the two main methods by which catastrophic consequences can be prevented, mass diagnostic testing and mass contact tracing, were wholly absent from this strategic debate.
So forgive me if you thought I wasn't answering your question. I was seeking to try to answer your question, but I perhaps went on to COVID more than the flu plan. I think one of your questions, which is reasonable, is the flu plan was looking at flu. And so some of what would have been perhaps in that plan, had it been looking more widely, was not there. What I was seeking to address was this notion, either in the flu plan or later in COVID, that there was simply an acceptance of a level of consequence. I think, forgive me, I can't remember the precise text in the 2011 flu plan, but I think there is commentary in it that reasonable worst-case scenario are not necessarily things you accept. They don't take account of the countermeasures that you take to try to reduce that. So either in that plan or in the eventual handling of COVID, speaking from my own perspective, it was not simply here's a level of consequence that we accept that we can't do anything about. I do think, and this goes to your point about mass testing and contact tracing, the question, very legitimate, is could or should we have done more to put ourselves in the ability of suppressing? It is also the case that I don't think for any responsible government it can ever, in a context like this, be either trying to suppress or dealing with the consequences. You have to do both, and that is a feature of the planning as well.
I'm going to put that over to Module 2A, Ms Sturgeon.
Forgive me.
But in relation, therefore, to the strategy, we appear to be agreed that the strategy, because it proclaimed its ability to be applicable to non-influenza pandemics, or whilst it proclaimed its ability to be flexible and applicable to non-influenza pandemics, simply did not provide the thinking or the tools necessary to be able to deal with them. I'm not asking you again about, and sure, I'm not seeking your answer in relation to how the Scottish Government did respond and what its approach was once it was struck by the pandemic, but in terms of the strategizing, the planning and the preparedness at an overarching level, that thinking and the development of the necessary tools was absent from the sole strategy document that was meant to be applicable.
I think that is fair, yes.
Right.
We're going to be break. I'm sorry, we have to take a break every so often, Ms Sturgeon, for the stenographer. Would that be a suitable?
Very suitable, thank you, my lady.
Right, I shall return at 11:30.
All right.
So, Ms Sturgeon, having been harnessed to the 2011 strategy, Scotland was, of course, aware that that strategy was required to be refreshed or updated, and you are aware, are you not, that one of the work streams which was assigned to the Pandemic Flu Readiness Board in London and to the Pandemic Flu Preparedness Board in Edinburgh was the job of updating that strategy, and it never came to pass.
That's correct.
And you agree that the reason why it never came to pass was that it was one of the work streams which was recognised to be necessary to be done, and because of the diversion of time, energy and resources to the necessary preparations for a no-deal EU exit, it happened to be one of the work streams that was paused.
Yes, that is correct. The prospect of a no-deal Brexit and the work that was required across all of the UK governments to plan for Yellowhammer assumptions meant that a significant amount of time, energy and resource was diverted into that from a range of other matters, and that was certainly one of the work streams that suffered from that. We may come on to this, so I won't go into detail right now. That is not to say there was not continued work in the Scottish Government to prepare for a pandemic, although, as we've already covered, much of that was in the context of a flu pandemic.
As you've rightly acknowledged, and as your then Director of Safer Communities Cabinet, Director of Safer Communities, Gillian Russell, accepts in her witness statement, a very significant amount of emergency planning time was spent on planning for a no-deal EU exit, and therefore something had to give. And one of the things that had to give was some of the work that was meant to be done for emergency planning. May we ask you, to what extent was that difficult decision, the diversion of resources, debated at cabinet level? It's apparent from a large number of documentation that the necessary diversion was ventilated at administrative level, was acknowledged and accepted, and officials just had to get on with the job in hand with the resources that they had. But to what extent was that brought to your attention for the ultimate decision as to whether or not that diversion of resources away from emergency planning was appropriate?
So I was very aware of the necessity to divert resources from other priorities to plan for and look at the potential for a no-deal Brexit. It wasn't the case, to the best of my memory, that somebody came to me and said we need to divert resources from pandemic preparedness to this, but I would have known that there were many other aspects of emergency planning that had resources diverted for them. The Scottish Cabinet discussed no-deal Brexit, Brexit generally, and the potential for a no-deal Brexit on many different occasions. Brexit obviously was something that was happening completely against the will of the Scottish Government, so we were not at all happy about what we were having to do. But to put it bluntly, we had no choice, because had a no-deal Brexit happened, and there were periods over 2019 where that was a distinct possibility, the consequences of that would have been very, very severe. The planning assumptions in Yellowhammer were grim and extremely worrying. So we had no alternative but to do that work to the best of our ability. And we have limited resources. All governments have limited resources. Within emergency planning, we have within that limited specialisms and skills in particular areas. So it stands to reason that with so much effort on that, there was going to be less resource available for other aspects of emergency planning.
But resources were rediverted from a number of different parts of the Scottish Government. It wasn't, I imagine, that resources were only rediverted from civil contingency planning.
No.
You had to find the resource and the time and the energy from somewhere in order to be able to do the necessary preparations for a no-deal exit.
There was probably not, and forgive me if I'm slightly oversimplifying this here, but there would not be many, if any, areas of Scottish Government work that were not impacted by the planning for Brexit generally and a no-deal Brexit. So in health, other than emergency planning, a lot of resource and energy looking at some of the supply chain disruptions, the consequences for the health service staffing of ending free movement across the European Union, and education, obviously, with universities around the education programme. So every part of our work was impacted by this, and it was a matter of deep and extreme regret and frustration for us at the time.
The risk of a pandemic influenza was a tier 1 risk in the United Kingdom government's risk register. Presumably, it was no less greater risk in the Scottish risk register. It was identified as the greatest risk facing the nation in the plethora of risks which any nation faces. So would you agree that the diversion of resource and money and time from that issue, that area of planning for the greatest risk which the country faced, the tier 1 influenza pandemic risk, was ultimately a false economy, because although the consequences of a no-deal EU exit would have been extremely serious and had to be mitigated, the one area from which it really couldn't be said that resources should sensibly be drawn would be the no less significant area of pandemic preparedness.
I don't disagree with that. I think every aspect of Brexit has been false economy, if I can put it mildly, but that's another issue altogether.
Ms. Sturgeon, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
That is a witness box, not a soapbox.
Indeed.
We cannot allow
Indeed.
the political debate of Brexit
Indeed.
to be ventilated here.
With respect, I think you're asking me questions here that are very germane to the whole issue. So yes, I think it was deeply regrettable that resources had to be diverted from any other area of work, and in particular pandemic preparedness. I also, though, would repeat a point I made earlier on, that it was certainly from the Scottish Government perspective, it was not the case that all preparation around the potential for a pandemic stopped. I would imagine you will ask me later in the session about Exercise Silver Swan. That was one of the key elements of work and different work strands out of that, of course. So all of that was deeply serious. The point I'm making is that we had little alternative but to do that. The consequences of a no-deal Brexit compared to what we faced with COVID, of course, pale into insignificance. But at the time, looking at the Yellowhammer assumptions, had they come to pass, they would have been severe. We were talking about availability of food and the shops and medicines for the National Health Service. So we had no choice but to do that planning. I deeply regret any implications that had for our emergency planning in other areas.
Thank you. That's very clear. Just turning now to the broad issue of the relations between Scotland and Westminster in terms of preparedness planning. Many of the recommendations which had come out of the Hine Review, to which you referred earlier, insofar as Scotland was concerned and the other devolved administrations, revolved around the need for a proper framework for communication, both at CMO level, the Chief Medical Officer level, and the DCMO level, the need for perhaps a health forum across the United Kingdom in which there could be a proper informed debate at that level about pandemic preparedness, and also, of course, between the civil services of the devolved administrations. To what extent do you believe that the working relationships in relation to pandemic preparedness worked across the devolved administration and UK level?
I think they worked reasonably well in general terms. I think they remained too ad hoc and didn't become, as the Hine Review would have recommended, more embedded in a very systemic way. I know, and this was certainly true At the outset of COVID, the working relationship between the 4 CMOs was very good and very strong, and Scotland's CMO at the time fed lots of information and thinking from those discussions into the decisions we were taking. I think discussions and relationships between health ministers would vary, I think, from my perspective over the years, often, as will sometimes be the case, depend on the individuals concerned, which is more of a feature when they are ad hoc arrangements rather than embedded. Overall, though, I think in the context of intergovernmental relations, work around in swine flu and from swine flu leading up to the beginning of COVID, I think relatively speaking, they worked well.
Presumably, an informal system of communication depends too much on personal inclination, personal relations, and perhaps ministerial whim as to whether or not the meetings take place. Did you ever get to the point where you believed that there had to be a significant effort made to formalise those working relationships, or did it never get to that stage?
I think it frequently gets to that stage in various discussions, and in this context, yes, I think it would be better if we had working relationships that were more systemised and embedded, and that would then transcend different individuals. That said, processes will not work, however embedded they are, if they don't have good faith and the right mindset and attitudes behind them. So in terms of the working between the 4 nations, in this context, or indeed any context, it's a combination of all of these things that is required, but certainly more of an embedded structure that is then respected by all of the governments at play, I think would be a step in the right direction.
Sturgeon, how do you get past, I don't know if you heard Jeremy Hunt come out with a brutally frank answer, which was that when he was Secretary of State for Health for the UK, for England and Wales, for England, sorry, he found that party politics got in the way of the relationship between ministers for health in the various administrations.
So I think that can happen, and I think it has happened. I also think it's possible to overstate the extent to which that happens. In my experience, forgive me just briefly to go back to swine flu, as Scottish Health Secretary at the start of swine flu, Alan Johnson was Health Secretary for England, then replaced by Andy Burnham. I had a very good working relationship with both of those, and different political perspectives at play there. So I think if the attitudes and the mindsets are correct, particularly in the context of a health emergency, political differences shouldn't get in the way. But of course that is going to depend from time to time on the different personalities involved. And forgive me, I'm not going to stray off the topic here, but inevitably that will be influenced, it shouldn't be, but it will be influenced by the wider political context at the time. And perhaps Brexit has an impact there in terms of setting the overall tone for some of these intergovernmental relationships.
You lent your considerable authority to a review of United Kingdom and national intergovernmental relations, did you not?
Yes.
Post-COVID, there is now a structure which provides, I think, for a devolved government council, for interministerial groups to meet. I think there's an interministerial standing committee or some sort of committee, and a secretariat, intergovernmental relation secretariat. Do you know whether or not that committee structure has borne fruit yet? Is it something which, as First Minister, you attended whilst you were in office?
Those new arrangements are very much in their infancy, and were even more in their infancy while I was still First Minister. So I think in many respects it remains to be seen the extent to which they improve the overall working relationship. I come back to a point I made earlier. I think systems and processes are really important, but they will only work if all of the parties participating in them participate in the right spirit and attitude, and that in intergovernmental relations is often where it breaks down. And I've been, as First Minister and for years before that as Deputy First Minister, involved in a range of different iterations, joint ministerial councils, these new arrangements, and they will work if everybody around the table is there in the right spirit.
My lady had evidence from Oliver Dowden, the Deputy Prime Minister, about how, but both before, but I think boosted by the National Resilience Framework in its publication by the United Kingdom Government in December 2022, there had been set up a UK resilience forum to discuss important issues relating to cross-United Kingdom resilience and civil contingency arrangements. The Scottish Government attended the first UK Resilience Forum, as did UK ministers, on the 14th of July 2021, but the Scottish Government was absent. It's listed as an absent participant in May 2022 and February 2023. So it has simply not attended 2 of the 3 UK Resilience Forum meetings. Do you happen to know why that is so?
I don't know for certain that it is the case. I appreciate your read, but I understand there may be some dubiety about whether we were in fact present on one of these occasions, but that's not something I can answer for you with certainty.
Well, you were present on the first meeting.
The Scottish Government was present. I personally wasn't present. I understand from my own colleagues that there is some uncertainty as to whether we were present at the second one or not. I know the minutes suggest that we weren't, but that's not an issue I can resolve for you right now. That resilience forum, I think, is an important opportunity for the 4 nations to come together. Its remit, although again it's a forum in its relatively early stages, seems to be similar to, perhaps not identical to, the Scottish Resilience Partnership, which is also a strategic overview. So certainly the ability to have a 4 nations forum that our own operations can feed into is certainly a useful one. I cannot answer why the Scottish Government, I can get that information for you. I can't answer here why we weren't present, if indeed we weren't present, but that is something I certainly would encourage ministers now to take part in.
Thank you. The minutes, I should say, both the 3rd of May 2022 and 23 do state in terms that the Scottish Government was wholly absent.
Can I say I wasn't questioning that particular point?
Now, the exercises, Silver Swan, Cygnus and Iris, the exercise Cygnus was a United Kingdom exercise delivered by Public Health England. It wasn't therefore focused centrally on Scotland. Scotland played an important part and attended it, and members of the Scottish Government were present during the exercise itself. Do you recall, whilst First Minister, debate about the extent to which the recommendations from Exercise Cygnus had been implemented? There is evidence, I should say before my lady, that on a UK level, many of the recommendations were, by the time of COVID, not implemented wholly. Some were in part implemented, some were not implemented at all, some were complete. What was the position with Scotland?
As I understand, so the first part of your question, would I have had an awareness? I would have had a general awareness of exercises and the Scottish Government working to implement recommendations that were relevant to us. I wouldn't have been closely involved on a day-to-day basis with that in detail. My understanding is that of the, I think, 22 recommendations out of Exercise Cygnus, the Scottish Government assessed all of them for their applicability or relevance to Scotland.
Yes.
And I believe at the time COVID struck us, there were 14 of those complete and 8 outstanding. Some of those would have been for the UK Government to take the lead on. I believe one on social care was paused by the UK Government due to Brexit, something we've already discussed. There was another around pandemic guidance that the UK Government was to take the lead on, but that hadn't been progressed. I think the other point I would make about this is in relation to both those recommendations that I've mentioned, there would have been analogous recommendations in Silver Swan that Scotland was pursuing. So on
Yes.
social care, there was a recommendation there about social care contracts, business continuity that we had considered complete, and in terms of pandemic guidance, with one exception, which was updated guidance for health and social care that had been out for consultation at the end of 2019. But other than that, the recommendations in Silver Swan for updating guidance had been taken forward.
In relation to exercise Iris, that was a one-day exercise. Was that a tabletop exercise?
Yes, it was.
And that was a Scottish exercise
Yes.
in March of 18. Was that the exercise that was concerned with an assumed outbreak of MERS?
Yes.
And what, Ms Sturgeon, was the outcome of that exercise in terms of the implementation of recommendations?
That was very much ongoing at the time COVID struck. Obviously, that exercise was the latest of the three that we're referring to right now, I think took place in 2018. There were, I think, of the 13 recommendations in it, there were 4 that had been completed, a number, 2, I think, that were ongoing, and then some others were paused when COVID came along for, when we look at some of them, for understandable reasons, because the system was dealing with a real pandemic at that time, and it would not have made sense to go forward in a separate track with the recommendations from IRIS. But IRIS is partly because of when it happened, is the one where at the outset of COVID there were most of the recommendations still outstanding, or more than in the other exercises.
I think it's fair to say, Ms Sturgeon, that there were no single work streams which were of great importance, which were wholly uncompleted. So although there were, I think, 3 areas where work had not been completed, other aspects of those work streams had been completed.
Are you still referring to exercise IRIS?
Yes.
Yes.
So in relation to, I think, updating guidance in relation to MERS-CoV, which obviously is not of great significance perhaps in terms of dealing with COVID, certain work to do with readying NHS boards to deal with the potential impact of contact tracing and community sampling during a HCID outbreak, and also finishing off the fit testing for particular types of PPE. Were those the broad areas that were still outstanding?
Yes, that is correct. And some of the PPE recommendations around fit testing initially came from Silver Swan, but there were similar recommendations out of exercise IRIS as well.
And then coming back to Silver Swan, which I acknowledge it was before IRIS, but the reason I'm coming to that last is for the importance of one of the work streams which came out of Silver Swan. I think of the 17 recommendations, 13 were considered by the Scottish Government to be complete, but an important area was pandemic guidance for the health and social care sector. Was that ever completed, even though Silver Swan was in 2015?
The specific guidance for health and social care had not been completed. It was out for consultation at the end of 2019 and therefore hadn't been finalised and signed off. The recommendation in exercise Silver Swan around pandemic guidance, though, incorporated more than that one piece of guidance, and all of the other aspects that we took forward had been completed. So NHS standards for organisational resilience had been published and reviewed, guidance on dealing with mass fatalities, guidance on death certification, pandemic flu guidance for infection prevention and control, and pandemic flu communications guidance. These other bits of guidance had been completed. The one outstanding part was the response and guidance documentation for health and social care, which was still at the consultative stage.
Yes. That was an important part of Silver Swan. It wasn't complete by the time of IRIS, and it wasn't complete by the time of COVID 4 years later.
That's correct.
All right. And is that primarily why the Auditor General of Scotland, who reported in February 2021 in the report NHS in Scotland 2020, to the effect that the Scottish Government could have been better prepared to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. It based its initial response on the 2011 strategy, which we've debated, but did not fully implement improvements identified during subsequent pandemic preparedness exercises. It was that issue of the failure to complete the work done in the adult social care sector that led to that conclusion.
I wouldn't want to speak for the Auditor General in saying what led to those conclusions. I would say my view would be that that would have been part of it. I think, I know there were other issues raised in the Audit Scotland report that you refer to around PPE availability and distribution. So I'm not sure I would agree that was the only issue that led to those conclusions, but certainly it would have been one of them. Perhaps for completeness, I should say that Audit Scotland report also did comment that the Scottish Government responded quickly to COVID when it confronted us.
Ms Sturgeon, that is, of course, an issue of response with which you and I are both aware we're not addressing, we're dealing with preparedness. I may have been a little unfair because paragraph 46 of that same report concludes, as a priority, the Scottish Government should update and publish national pandemic guidance for health and social care, from which we deduced that that was the area that was outstanding. Has that guidance now been published? Do you know?
I do not believe that has yet been published, but you forgive me, I've not been in the Scottish Government for 3 months now. And I think the Audit Scotland report reflected this. There is a real importance in ensuring that that guidance, which had been out for consultation before COVID, fully reflects the learning from COVID.
But Ms Sturgeon, that report was issued in February 2021. You ceased being First Minister on the 28th of March of this year. During that elapse of 2 years while you were First Minister, was that national guidance for the health and social care sector published?
No. I can only give an opinion here. I think from my experience to have published guidance without properly assessing some of the lessons, we also commissioned and established a standing committee on pandemic preparedness, and I think it is important that the health service in Scotland, as I'm sure is the case in the other nations of the UK, has lots of guidance that it operates within and that it takes cognizance of. In terms of pandemic guidance, I think it is really important that there is a proper, fulsome exercise to incorporate properly the granular as well as some of the strategic learning from the COVID pandemic.
And to conclude, the reference to which you've just made about a standing committee, is that the Standing Committee on Pandemic Preparedness, which is a permanent advisory group which you commissioned? It now sits permanently, comprising scientists, experts, the CMO, the Deputy CMO and others, to make recommendations for the better promotion of pandemic preparedness in Scotland.
Yes.
And has that committee already issued an interim report, I think it did so in August last year, making recommendations about various aspects of pandemic preparedness?
It issued an interim report that I responded to while I was still First Minister. I think it made 3 interim recommendations, one proposing a centre for pandemic preparedness, another relating to the data and analytics infrastructure that we have and in its view should develop in Scotland, and a third around how we build and strengthen scientific advisory networks both within Scotland and across the UK and link into international organisations as well. It is due in coming months to publish a more substantive report with longer-term recommendations, as I understand it.
And there was a fourth, continued innovation in the sciences and public health research.
Forgive me, that was the third one I was referring to. Forgive me if that was a fourth and I've missed the third one.
That's all right. Ms Sturgeon, thank you very much. Milady, would you give me 1 moment?
I think I've given provisional permission to Scottish COVID bereaved to ask a question.
Milady has.
I confirm permission's granted. Mr Anwar.
Good afternoon, Ms Sturgeon. I have a handful of questions left to ask on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. In your evidence earlier, you readily accepted there was a gap in terms of the pandemic you were ultimately dealing with, but that did not mean the plan had no utility at all. So I'm going to refer you to the joint expert report that was prepared for this inquiry on health inequalities for Module 1 by Professor Sir Michael Marmo and Professor Claire Bamborough. I refer you specifically to inquiry 000195843, page 0064, paragraph 149. I'm not going to take you through it, but to summarise, he concluded that with some exceptions, the specialist structures concerned with the risk management and civil emergency planning did not properly consider societal, economic and health impacts in light of pre-existing inequalities and the UK government and the devolved administrations, and relevant public health bodies did not systematically or comprehensively assess pre-existing social and economic inequalities and the vulnerabilities of different groups during a pandemic in their planning for risk assessment processes. So, Ms Sturgeon, the question is, do you accept that this analysis would also apply to the Scottish Government in their pandemic planning?
In broad terms, yes, I would. I don't think that we sufficiently, to use the terms there, systematically or comprehensively assessed socio-economic health inequalities and therefore how we dealt with them in the context of a pandemic. So I think I would accept that. Again, I don't think it is right to go from there to say there was no planning and no thought given to that. Again, I won't repeat it. I think some of this is narrated in the expert report that you're quoting to me, the work that the Scottish Government had done starting, again, when I was Health Secretary, around the Equally Well work, culminating in April 2020 in the establishment of Public Health Scotland, which is actually, in an organisational sense, one of the initiatives intended to build that systemic and comprehensive approach to, in particular, health inequalities into our planning work.
Thank you. The second question is, to what extent, if any, did the Scottish Government carry out an equalities and human rights assessment of its pandemic preparedness plans?
If I can answer in summary there and offer to seek more information to be provided, because it is a question that would involve looking at lots of different aspects of planning. The Scottish Government does and will have carried out different impact assessments of different aspects of our planning, both in preparedness and then as we went into the response phase to COVID. I don't have all of the detail of that in front of me right now, but I can, through those in the Scottish Government, seek to have that provided if that is helpful.
Thank you. That would be helpful, and we would be seeking that information, asking the inquiry to seek that information. And the third question, Ms Sturgeon, is to what extent, if any, were those plans assessed as to how they would affect the various protected characteristics in terms of the Equality Act 2000, for example, age, disability, maternity, race, religion, sex and sexual orientation, amongst others?
So again, apologies if I'm repeating myself, that would have been part of impact assessments that would be carried out routinely on Scottish Government work and planning. Again, I will have to get you more detail of that in terms of the sort of granular information. Again, I am moving into the response phase here, but you will be aware, I'm sure, one of the things we did early on in the response phase was to set up an expert group on ethnic minority inequalities in order that as we went through the response phase we could make sure that we were adapting appropriately there. But in terms of the detail of the impact assessments and protected characteristic assessments, as I say, I will seek to, if the inquiry would find it helpful, to have more information passed to it.
That would be helpful. Those are the answers of my questions.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Mr. Bramwell. It would be helpful if you could provide that information, Ms Sturgeon. Can I just check, were you saying that it's your understanding that impact assessments routinely included consideration of protected characteristics?
Forgive me, my lady, I wouldn't want to leave you with that. I'm not sure that that would not be an overstatement. So again, I think the information I'm offering to have provided through the offices of the Scottish Government would answer that question for you. Certainly that would be involved in impact assessments, but I wouldn't want to attach more relevance to the word routinely than I feel confident to give you right now.
Thank you very much.
My lady, rather than setting too great a hair running, it may help Mr. Anwar if my lady recalls for him that the evidence of Miss Lamb yesterday included a section dealing with the consideration by Scotland of health inequalities, and my lady will recall that there was in the course of evidence, she referred to the Auditor General for Scotland's report on health inequalities 2012, equally well 2013, the NHS Health Scotland's Health Inequalities Policy Review 13, and then 5 public health reports between 2013 and 2022, which therefore provide the basis, along with the Public Sector Equality Duty and the Equality Act 2010, for the consideration of health inequalities.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Ms Sturgeon. That's all for today. Next time we meet, I suspect, will be in Scotland. Thank you.